We allege that the defendant made repeated heinous threats to murder and torture Supreme Court justices and their families to retaliate against them for decisions he disagreed with. The messages contained violent, racist, and homophobic rhetoric, coupled with threats of assassination by torture, hanging, and firearms. Take a look at the press release from the Justice Department out of Alaska. Let's blow it up as big as we can because it's sort of tiny print, but I'll read it for you. Alaska man arrested for threatening U.S. Supreme Court justices and their family members. An Alaska man was arrested yesterday in Anchorage for allegedly threatening to injure and kill 6 U.S. Supreme Court justices and some of their family members. It's maddening here that the actual 6 justices are not named. I don't understand why they wouldn't do that other than for political purposes, but I think we can connect the dots here, can't we? I think we can. According to court documents, between March 10th, 2023 and July 16th, Panos Anastasiou, 76 years old, sent over 465 messages to the Supreme Court through a public website the court maintained. Here's a quote from the indictment. We allege that the defendant made repeated heinous threats to murder and torture Supreme Court justices and their families to retaliate against them for decisions he disagreed with. This is according to Attorney General Merrick Garland. Our justice system depends on the ability of judges to make their decisions based on the law and not on fear. Our democracy depends on the ability of public officials to do their jobs without fearing for their lives or the safety of their families. Beginning on January 4th, Anastasiou's messages allegedly escalated to messages intending to threaten harm toward the victims. The messages contained violent, racist, and homophobic rhetoric, coupled with threats of assassination by torture, hanging, and firearms. All right, our buddy Greg Price also has some details on this indictment, as you can see. Over 400 violent threats against 6 Supreme Court justices. Indictment doesn't say which. He made 82 donations, by the way, to Act Blue, the most recent of which was in July 25. Here's a screenshot of his donations through the Federal Elections Commission. As you can see, Act Blue, Act Blue, Act Blue. Who's Act Blue? Act Blue is a left-wing Democrat donation clearinghouse. This guy is a lefty. He's a liberal. He's an activist for the Democrats. That's where he gives his money. Take a look at some of these messages. This is contained in the indictment. May 17th, 2024. I'm going to call and urge my fellow Vietnam veterans to drive by the Supreme Court justice. They've redacted the name, but drive by blank's house with their AR-15s. And when effing Supreme Court justice and his effing piece of bleep C-word wife are home, spray the home of these disrespectful MFers with hundreds of rounds, hopefully killing these scumbag C-suckers. Hopefully, N-word Supreme Court Justice number 1, I think we can guess who that is, and his white trailer trash, N-word loving insurrectionist wife are visiting. I think it's clear that the last part of that thread is about Clarence Thomas and his wife, Ginny. This is a left-wing liberal maniac sending these hateful, despicable, racist, violent messages, over 400 of them, to Supreme Court justices. Brazenly, by the way, in an open forum, he's doing this. June 18th, 2024. I don't want to see these 2 corrupt MFers assassinated. I'd like to see them tortured worse than Kim Jong-un would torture his own family. You know, like putting electrodes up their ass and on their balls, needles under their fingernails, pulling their teeth with pliers, etc. Make these scumbags beg for their lives. The most recent message came July 5th, according to this indictment. We should make Supreme Court justices 1 through 6 be afraid, very afraid to leave their home and fear for their lives every day. July 3rd, we need mass assassinations. By the way, this is just 10 days before the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. We keep hearing how conservatives and MAGA types are the threat to our nation, threat to our Constitution, threat to our democracy. We keep hearing that they're the violent ones, but look at this. Look at this. Look at who they are. Look at the fever swamp in which they're dwelling. We need mass assassinations. If you're corrupt, you're corrupt. Don't give us this official and unofficial BS. You MFers are unelected, and Americans have no trust in you. The internet is abuzz with Americans clamoring for your assassinations. We need to assassinate you effers and put your heads on a pike and use them as soccer balls. I want to be the first to kick Supreme Court Justice Six's head down Pennsylvania Avenue. You don't want to ask me what I'd like to do to the N-word. And Supreme Court Justice number 2, pleasant, delightful, a donor in good standing for the Democrat Party. All of that included, by the way, in this indictment that was issued today. You can read it online as well. You should read it out online. Everyone should know about this. So how did we get here exactly? You know, we've just spent the last couple of days talking about the violent, divisive, vitriolic rhetoric that we've seen on the national stage, from the President of the United States to the Vice President of the United States to her running mate, talking about how Donald Trump is an existential threat to this country, talking about how Donald Trump needs to be eliminated, talking about how Donald Trump needs to be stopped. And it continues day in and day out. Just 24 hours after this latest assassination attempt in West Palm Beach, Florida, we had people on MSNBC comparing Donald Trump to Hitler, saying that we're going to have jackboot troops goose-stepping down the street if he gets elected, that there will be brown shirts, that children will become part of Trump youth, you know, just like Hitler youth. Get it? We had Karine Jean-Pierre at the press briefing on Tuesday constantly referring to Donald Trump as a threat, a threat, a threat. And when called on it, she says, oh, but you're the problem for questioning me for using language like this, right? They didn't stop. They didn't pause. They didn't take a breath after the latest assassination attempt. And it goes on and on and on. And now we learned this about these threats against the Supreme Court. And I think it's pretty relevant to point out the kind of rhetoric that we've heard from these very same people about the Supreme Court justices. Let's remind you of Chuck Schumer. Just 6 years ago, I think it was? Here's Chuck Schumer on the steps in front of the Supreme Court when a decision came down that he didn't like.
I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions.
And that was before the Dobbs decision. Naming Gorsuch by name. I wonder if Justice Gorsuch is one of the redacted names from this indictment. I bet he is. Release the whirlwind. You won't know what hit you. I mean, it could be language used by this guy who just got indicted. I just read you some of the things he was saying. Now, that was several years ago. What about more recently? Well, first of all, Kamala Harris, let's not get recent for a second, because around that same time, during the Kavanaugh hearings, Kamala Harris, a then U.S. Senator there from California, decided that the Kavanaugh hearings was going to be her entree into national politics. This was going to launch her presidential career, and she did. She tried to get a ton of headlines during the Kavanaugh hearings, and then just months later, she announced that she was running for president. Now, of course, that crashed and burned and was disastrous, but it did at least put her on the national stage, and it made the case for Joe Biden to select her as vice president. And now, well, here we are. By the way, Kamala Harris learned how to do this from Joe Biden. See, Joe Biden back in the 80s used the Justice Bork confirmation hearings to launch his presidential ambitions. That also crashed and burned back in 88, but he hung in there long enough to finally make it to the White House. So here's Kamala Harris talking about Justice Kavanaugh at the time, which, by the way, I'm pretty sure Justice Kavanaugh is one of those justices who was threatened by this dirtbag today. Well, let's remember how Kamala Harris treated Kavanaugh and how she characterized him at the time.
So the invisible, not so invisible hand of the White House was basically orchestrating, choreographing, curating what the Judiciary Committee would learn about this nominee to serve for a lifetime on the highest court in our land, a court that is supposed to do the work of justice, a court where inscribed in the marble that houses it, we say equal justice under law. It was a sham.
So the confirmation hearing was a sham, she says. And did you hear the language? The hidden hand of the administration orchestrating this. This is conspiracy theory talk. This is fever swamp talk. These are dog whistle buzzwords that resonate with people like this maniac in Alaska sitting in his basement, firing off these threatening, profane messages to Supreme Court justices about torturing them. But this is like mother's milk to people like that. Do you hear the language she's using? The confirmation process was a sham, the hidden hand of the right. This is dark stuff, but it's not kept in the shadows. It's broadcast internationally on mainstream media, and she gets away with it without ever worrying about the ramifications. We're seeing the ramifications today in this indictment. Watch the rest of it.
And when we talk about expecting that people will have a sense of respect for the system of justice, we have to recognize that the process by which he was confirmed has created a crisis of confidence.
They have been dehumanizing these Supreme Court justices since day one, and they have been working overtime to delegitimize the Supreme Court ever since the majority, the last three justices were named by Donald Trump. They have been calling for reforms. They want to stack the court. They've been saying that the Supreme Court is corrupt. They've been saying these justices are corrupt. They've been saying that they should be impeached. They've been saying that they should be term limited out, that the Constitution should be altered, that they should be expanding the number of seats on the Supreme Court to accommodate their desire to stack the court. This is what they've been saying out loud on a daily basis with this drumbeat. No wonder some maniac took their rhetoric and ran with it. I assure you on cable news, you're not hearing this analysis. I assure you on CNN and on MSNBC, and certainly on George Stephanopoulos' and David Muir's ABC News, you won't hear the analysis that I'm giving you. They won't connect these dots. In fact, they may even bury this story and not even talk about it. Why? Because they agree with it. They agree with everything that these people have been saying about the Supreme Court. Let's fast forward now to just 1 month ago. Joe Biden, I believe he thinks he's still president of the United States. He announced sweeping desires to reform the Supreme Court. And what was the rationale for all of these reforms, all of these changes that he wants to put in place at the Supreme Court? He told you the rationale.
In the face of increasing threats to American democratic institutions, I use the Commission's analysis. And today I'm calling for 3 bold reforms.
We're not even going to get into his so-called reforms because they're meaningless, but you heard the rationale for it. Threats to democratic institutions. They keep using that word threat, don't they? They say that this corrupt Supreme Court stacked with corrupt justices put in place by a corrupt hidden hand in the Trump administration are an existential threat to democratic institutions and the basic human rights of every American individual. And then they're going to act shocked that some maniac actually believed them. That's what happened today with this breaking story. That's what you need to know. And yeah, you're not going to get that analysis anywhere else.